Amen.
There's a lot of questions from these papers on religion, so maybe we ought to hit one and let them count for all. This one says, discuss guilt feelings of the Christian homosexual.
There are Christian homosexuals and there are Christian homosexuals. The church has done its best over the years to induce profound feelings of guilt in homosexuals, as it has, for that matter, in many ways, in people who engage in any kind of sex. Christianity is fundamentally anti-sexual. Read St. Paul sometime. So that, and I think it's been it has created a tremendous amount of totally unnecessary misery. Now, which continues. Now, these attitudes are changing. We've been working continuingly and increasingly closely with the churches over the last decade. They're coming around now, many of them at least. The battle isn't won, but they're coming around to be among our staunchest allies, bit by bit. Church groups are beginning to pass resolutions taking a new and considerably more accepting view toward homosexuality. They're assisting us in many other ways. For example, in Washington, where we're attempting to improve the social situation by having monthly dances. The first two of those were held in an Episcopal church. The third one was held in a synagogue. So the church attitudes at the ground level, the basic level, the practical level, are changing. In addition, homosexuals now are becoming increasingly militant. And we're not asking the churches to cease rejecting us. We are now beginning to tell the churches, you behave yourselves or we will reject you before you reject us, and we'll go out and form our own Christian churches, which will be a lot more Christian than you ever thought of being. And this is exactly what we're commencing to do. And there are now gay churches being formed in a number of cities, Christian churches, which are simply dealing with homosexuality on a not just merely, the word accepting is sort of condescending, on a, they're built, I'll use the word anyway, for want of a better one, on a completely accepting kind of basis. And I think the whole approach of Christianity and religion in general toward homosexuality is changing very rapidly and for the good. And with that, the guilt, with that and the increased militancy and feeling of gay pride in general, the guilt feelings, while they have a long way to go yet, particularly for many older homosexuals, are beginning to dissipate and rapidly.
A question to which both of you might address yourselves is it possible for one to be bisexual, or as another participant asked, where does a person who is AC/DC fit in?
My own view, and I'm not sure if we agree on this or not, my own view is that homosexual, heterosexual behavior is sexual behavior, and that people develop their tastes in sex as they learn them from their situations in life and so on. And I reject the notion of a homosexual or a heterosexual. I think there are people who behave more homosexually or more heterosexually or exclusively homosexually or exclusively heterosexually. But this notion that I am in some intrinsic way heterosexual or homosexual, that there's something genetic or biologic or intrinsic, in that I personally reject we lack evidence that it's so. I don't reject it on any moral grounds. If it should prove to be the case, and you could demonstrate it to be so, and there's some research being done that has hopes of establishing that. But until it's established, my own choice is to believe that it is learned, that choices are learned. And therefore, there are, as you would expect, in a society that pushes, that hustles, as it were, heterosexuality, you have the majority of people are predominantly heterosexual, grading off into those who are increasingly homosexual in their choice. Many people are mostly just sexual. That is, if they're in a situation that have no females, even though they might prefer a female, they'll take a male, if it's an army camp or a boys' school or something. And another situation, if girls are more available, they might take girls. And others have very deep affectional relationship for both men and women. You mentioned marriage of homosexuals, and I agree, they're frequently tragic because there's often a great affection for a man's wife, and yet her inability to accept his real preference for homosexual attachments. And there's just no, as you pointed out, there's no clean, easy, nice way out of that. And so I think that if you just think of people as humans who have learned different sexual patterns of behavior that are very important to them, then the AC/DC person either is a situational AC/DC, that is, a person who has a preference, homosexual, heterosexual, but takes it as he finds it, which might be different from situation to situation, or he may be a person who has the ability and preference, the capacity perhaps, to relate to both men and women sexually with whatever degree of depth he personally is capable of. By that I mean different people are more shallow and less shallow, whether homosexual or heterosexual. And so I would see a whole string of human behavior and not talk about people like they're either heterosexual with a big stamp in their brain and somewhere, or homosexual with a stamp in their brain somewhere. And then there's some people who get stamped very clearly, you know. I reject that as an idea.
I'm in substantial agreement. I define a homosexual and a heterosexuality both in terms of a primary or a dominant preference, not necessarily an exclusive one. In most of life and most things, really as part of being a human being, you have preferences in just about everything, whether it's the food you eat or the music you listen to or the clothing you wear or the way you decorate your apartment. And these preferences are sometimes exclusive. There are foods that you absolutely won't eat or music that you won't listen to. In many instances, in most instances, they're preferences. You prefer one food to another, but you'll certainly eat and enjoy them both. And you would rather expect this kind of thing to be so in terms of the people to whom you relate closely and affectionately in a whole variety of ways, including gender. I'm sure there are some men, for example, who will date only blondes, and others who will prefer blondes but will certainly enjoy a date with a brunette. And so all preferences are that way, and your homosexual and heterosexual ones tend to be that way also. However, you then run into what society does when it starts to make an issue of the preference. At that point, you begin to get a polarization, a pigeonholing, a compartmentalization. Let me give you an example purposely taken on a kind of a trite, superficial, almost facetious kind of way, basis. You may, for example, prefer lamb chops to pork chops. Fine. You'll eat both, and if you don't have one, you'll enjoy the other. But suppose society started to make an issue out of this and started to pass value judgments. Immediately, you would tend to become either a lamb chopper or a pork chopper. And if society passed a negative value judgment on pork choppery, you would tend to think less of yourself, and society would tend to condemn you, or you would feel proud of yourself because you like lamb chops, and there would be a few people who would be deeply anguished because they were bi-choppers, and they would feel an urge to be in one category or in the other. Well, that's exactly what has happened here. And as societal attitudes now are beginning to relax, more and more people are beginning to relate to other people as the circumstances may warrant, homosexually or heterosexually, though we have a long way to go till people accept this with full equanimity. They will still retain, in all likelihood for most people, a primary preference, but they won't be compelled to compartmentalize, to polarize, to pigeonhole, to label.
Dr. Broderick and then Dr. Kameny, what effect do you think pornography has on the young heterosexual growing up? And then what effect do you think pornography has on the young homosexual as he grows up?
The weight of evidence is that for boys, pornography doesn't seem to have any effect since they have so many ways of thinking about sex, visualizing sex, talking about sex. Pornography is just added visual aids, and it doesn't really seem to have a great effect on them. There's some evidence that it does sexualize females who are otherwise less exposed to sexual material in general. But as far as I'm able to interpret the studies, there's just simply no evidence that pornography has impact on boys, and little evidence, very small samples and not very stable studies really. But there's at least enough to suggest the possibility that it may have some sexualizing effect upon females that it doesn't have on males. But really, like anything else, you take one thing like spanking. What kind of children are the kind of children who were spanked as kids? Well, spanking is not not a very important determinant of what kind of people you are. And in the same way, pornography doesn't seem to be a very important determinant of what kind of people you are. It's more likely, if there is a connection, it would be that there would be some kind of people who need the help and aid to their fantasy, whose own lives are impoverished, and who find in this kind of thing a substitute for satisfying relationships. Especially, I think, in pornography, you have power, don't you? Because, again, you write the script, it's there in front of you, you can do anything you want with it. You know, it's not a real live person who's going to give you guff, talk back, assert their civil rights, and so on. And really, I'm afraid that the weight of evidence is that pornography is just not a very big deal, as no single thing is. Life's very complex, and what we are is not determined by single factors.
I look upon pornography as good, clean, harmless fun, and don't particularly see it doing any harm to anybody. It seems to substitute very nicely for the real thing in a society which unfortunately makes the real thing all too difficult to be available.
Dr. Kameny, this question is directed at you. What do you say to homosexuals who are unhappy with their lot?
I feel that most homosexuals who are unhappy with their lot are in basically the same kind of situation. The assumption is unhappy with their lot and therefore would prefer to be heterosexuals, at least I assume that's what the questioner intended, are in essentially the same kind of situation, now somewhat passé, of the black who tried to pass as white. They've been brainwashed by society into a feeling that their homosexuality and therefore they themselves are inferior, are second-rate, are less satisfactory inherently, and therefore they seek to change. And my approach would be to attempt to lead the individual into a constructive, productive approach toward his homosexuality, to live with it, not against it, to build a satisfying, fulfilling, rewarding, constructive, and productive life around it. As the homosexual that he is, that he should be proud of being, and that he has a right to be and to remain.
I've been asked to make an announcement. The people who were signing up, the encounter group participants, forgot to tell you. We're meeting in room 212 of the Union tomorrow at 8:45. The next question could lose us our jobs in Iowa, but you have sort of answered this already, Dr. Kameny. So for Dr. Broderick, what do you think of sex education?
Well,
I didn't really answer it.
how can you be against something that's so pervasive? Sex education is with us always. I presume the person means, what do I think about instituting it as a curriculum in school? And I think I would want to look at the particular curriculum. You know, there are dumb people who can do dumb things in sex education, just as there are wise people who can do good things. Myself, I've been an advocate of studying ways in which the schools can aid parents and a society in helping people to realize their sexual potential more fully. And by sexual potential, I do not mean their skill at making love in bed, solely at any rate. I'm really referring to things that we've been talking about more generally here tonight, your sense of being at peace with your own sexuality, your own understanding, first of all, about your own body and how it functions. For example, there's no room in this world, it seems to me, for a girl to be terrified of her own first period. I think of one of my colleagues who was raised in this state, who was a 4-H girl, and liked to fancy herself, and her friends fancied her as someone who really knew the scoop, because, you know, she'd bred cattle, and so when she got bussed into the town, her girlfriends would hustle around and say, you know, now what about this, and what about that, and what the cause of this, and she'd give them all the answers. Well, when she had her first period, she knew just what to do. She was on the school bus, and she tightened all of her sphincters, and made it home. It happened that at that time her family was taking an afternoon break in the kitchen, and she dashed through the kitchen and up the stairs to her bedroom and said, lock me up, I'm in heat." Well, you know, there's no necessity for that. 4-H is all right, but is it enough? The attitude of some educators to this, I was giving a talk on this in an elementary school, and I asked them when they showed the premenstrual film, and there was silence, and finally the principal, with great urging, got up and said, well, we just think that's, we show that in the junior high school as far as I know, but we just don't think that's right for young girls to be. I said, well, why not? In junior high school, for instance, they've already been menstruating for 2 years. What's the point of waiting until junior high school and telling them what they've been doing, you know? And he said, well, we just don't want to put any ideas into their heads. The notion of, you know, girls seeing this film and then going out and menstruating promiscuously all over the place. And so I guess I really do believe that there's a lot of room for just plain information of a wholesome sort. And then I think also, I don't know if homosexuals have the same problem. I would guess less so, perhaps. But the sexes are divided by culture, you know, they're different cultures. And often the communication between men and women, even in marriage, is not very good. I think it's probably better today than it has been in the past because we live in a uniculture where men and women get the same mass media and the same education, and there are many things more alike now than there used to be. But it's still very common in my practice as a marriage counselor to find that husbands and wives simply don't know how to trust or relate to the opposite sex, though they're married. And I think there's a place in the schools for males and females to get together with some kind of supervision, and where it's not on a confrontation, bargaining basis that they're talking about these things, for guys to talk with girls as a group, you know, why are you girls this way? Why do you pretend to be so coy and one thing and another, and you say maybe when you mean yes, and you say no when you mean maybe, and so I don't understand why you girls aren't open and free like us men, and put it right on the table, and a girl might say to a guy, what the hell's wrong with you guys? You only want one thing, just one thing, you don't care, the whole of the mattress, it's all you want, and a guy gets an opportunity to talk about this, and to girls, and hear what they think about this, and I think that there's a real good that comes from boys and girls who are of an age where they're dating each other and confronting each other in this sort of negotiating, ego-risking business of courtship, to learn about each other in their separate worlds and to learn how to talk to each other in this sort of protected atmosphere. So that I think good information and communication skills, and finally a wholesome attitude. We come from an era when St. Paul had a lot to do with it, I agree. He seemed to have problems in this area, where people really have been terribly uncomfortable with this whole part of life. And I don't know anything that's improved when you're terribly uncomfortable with it, and sex perhaps least of all. And I do not believe that you ought to show pictures of sexual intercourse, say, now, did you notice the left elbow in position 43? That's right. No, my experience is most people are able to figure out, and why spoil the joy of it by giving them a manual of instructions? And I don't think that technique education is really very valuable. Most people who have sex problems are not in problems because they don't know where to put their elbow. Their nose maybe, but their elbow. So I guess I'm in favor of it because it seems a humane thing to develop positive information and attitudes and communication skills in the area of sex. But it could be botched, and I'd want to be careful that good people were teaching sensible things to young people.
I agree substantially. I'm very much in favor of sex education. I think it's critically necessary considering the mess we're making of it in general in this country, and we've made of it in the past. But certainly with regard to homosexuality, I think at present it's being very badly done, and I think it needs to be done properly.
This is going to be sort of a two-part question, probably for Dr. Kameny. First of all, why are males more frequently homosexuals than females? Is this true? Are females becoming organized as homosexuals? And thirdly, in the interim before gay dances and other gay social functions are developed, what would you suggest to the under 21 homosexual, especially the female, for meeting other homosexuals interested in developing depth relationships? Is that too long?
All right. First, the first question, if I understand it correctly, asks whether male homosexuality is more prevalent than female homosexuality. And the answer is difficult to get at. Male sexuality in our society makes itself more obvious than female sexuality, and therefore any subsidiary form of sexuality, including specifically homosexuality, does the same. So there seems to be, certainly at first glance, more male homosexuality than female homosexuality. Now, I've seen studies which have estimated the incidence of lesbianism anywhere from several times as much as male homosexuality to a fraction as much. And all the studies seem equally valid or perhaps equally invalid. So for the moment, by default, we sort of assume that the incidence of female and male homosexuality is about the same. If better data comes along, I'll change what I'm saying. Incidentally, I was asked a question just briefly during the intermission. Ordinarily, when I talk, and I neglected to do so this time, I point out that, and it applies this time to my main talk, that for convenience in phrasing and casting sentences, I usually express myself in terms of the male homosexual. But everything that I say, unless I indicate explicitly otherwise, applies and applied there to the female, to the lesbian, with the signs reversed, so to speak. I was not speaking out of any sense, at least not any conscious sense, of male chauvinism. Now, are females organized, female homosexuals organizing as much as males are? Yes, most of the homophile organizations, with a couple of exceptions, include men and women both. In fact, one of the most successful and oldest of the homophile organizations is the Daughters of Bilitis, which has existed since 1955, and that's a completely female group. Now, again, you run into a sociological phenomenon in our society, which really is part of the whole complex that leads to women's lib, namely that women don't come out and participate in organizations or in anything else, no matter how fully welcome they are, to the extent that men do. So that most of these organizations tend to be more men than women, often quite unwillingly so. The Mattachine Society of Washington, to which I belong and with which I work in Washington, is a third to a half women. Finally, as to what women can do until we get things going, what they can do for social activity, for the moment, unfortunately, there's very little that can be answered there. And I know I get calls from boys and girls at high school age as to what they can do, and for the moment, if there are no organizations, all I can say is keep your antennae out, sending and receiving. 1 out of 10 of your fellow students are in the same fix, which is very easy for me to say, but not as easy for them to do. And I'm afraid for the moment, there isn't very much that I can recommend except get yourself organized and get gay dances going fast.
In line with that, there's been several questions asked about where you get the figure 10% and how that can be substantiated, and so I'd like you to address yourself to that.
All right. The 10% comes first out of my... You have to start off, if you're going to speak of statistics on anything, you have to define what it is you're statisticking about. And I've already defined homosexuality as a primary or dominant preference, not necessarily an exclusive one, for relating closely and intimately, affectionately as well as sexually, to persons of the same sex. Now, with that as a starting point, the best data that we have at present, although they have a great many failings, are still the Kinsey data. However, they have to be interpreted with some care. The Kinsey data deal largely, perhaps not quite completely, but largely, with behavior, with what people do. My definition of homosexuality was in terms of a primary or dominant preference. In an ideal society, these would coincide perfectly. Ours is not an ideal society, and we're dealing with a highly repressive situation in which preference does not always coincide with behavior, often far from it. So we have to examine the Kinsey data with some care and caution and try to interpret them. When we do that and combine it with extensive, long-standing, long-term, knowledgeable observation of the larger community, we can say with some uncertainty, this is certainly not a hard piece of data, but that as a probably somewhat conservative figure, somewhat below the truth but not far from it, a nice, round, handy number to use, that about 10% of the non-juvenile, by which I mean post-pubertal population, men and women both, for the reasons I indicated a moment ago, are homosexual, which means that there are about 15 million of us in the country, which makes of us the largest minority in the country after the blacks. This means also that about 1 out of 10 of the people in any large group with whom you associate are homosexual, which means 1 out of 10 of your fellow students here at this university, 1 out of 10 of the people in any of your classes, and in all likelihood, 1 out of 10 of the people in this room and in this audience are homosexual, although you will have no way of knowing who they are unless they reveal themselves or circumstances reveal them.
Let me just say one thing about that, because we haven't either of us mentioned it. There is a widespread belief that you can spot a homosexual.
Yeah.
You can tell them because they kind of wiggle their hips when they walk, and they do this a lot, and they have a high squeaky voice, and they have effeminate. Now, that's just nonsense. There are some homosexuals who affect feminism in the same way that there are people who write fuck on the wall to attract attention and to say up yours to the society. But it is not true that there is anything intrinsic about homosexual choices that makes a person effeminate. They're separate things. Unless it happens to be one of that, I don't know what the percentage would be. They used to say 20% of, I don't have any idea where that figure came from, of homosexuals who affect effeminacy in a manner to sort of say, you don't like it, you know what you can do about it, buddy. You know, that's a different kind of thing. But in terms of being able to, quote, spot a heterosexual or a homosexual by their body build, cruelly, when I was a kid, if a boy had wide hips and a small penis and gym, you know, and a high voice, he got teased about his sexual preference. Now, maybe he had sexual preferences, but the assumption was he was teased about being a fairy, quote unquote, when he was in fact effeminate in his build. The two are independent of each other. And we haven't said that because perhaps we tend to take it for granted, but there's still a very widespread belief that you can spot them a mile away by the way they walk. You're probably spotting somebody who happens to have hip joints that are formed just a little differently than yours and says nothing about his sexual preference at all.
Let me comment on that. Every minority group has its stereotypes. And of course, you're familiar, as was mentioned, with the stereotype of the effeminate male and the masculine female. These are a small minority with high visibility of a minority which otherwise has no visibility at all. And the average homosexual differs in no respect but his affectional and sexual preferences from the heterosexual around him, and you won't know him unless he chooses to reveal himself or circumstances do. And whatever, in terms of the male homosexual, whatever your own personal, individual, subjective stereotype happens to be of the ultimate epitome of masculinity, football players, truck drivers, ditch diggers, members of the Marine Corps, or what have you, the same percentage of those, same 10% of those groups as of any other group are homosexual.
I was just wondering if sociologists fit into the stereotype. Could either of you discuss some factors in our culture which lead to such feelings as hostility, disgust, and almost fear on the part of, quote, normal men towards homosexuals? And another question, saying essentially the same thing, said that this person's observation was that males who are heterosexual seem to have more fear of homosexuals than female heteros. Good.
Well, there's two theories about that. There's a psychoanalytic theory that says that everybody's bisexual and that a homosexual, that there's a homosexual and a heterosexual part of everybody, and that firmly ensconced heterosexual doesn't want anybody arousing any homosexual tendencies in him because it panics him, it frightens him. And so he withdraws, he disassociates himself, he hits the guy in the jaw, he overreacts because he's terrified of the potential that he may have in himself for a homosexual response. And that makes some sense to me in the sense that I personally believe, as I've told you, that we all learn that we're capable of responding to any human person with warmth. For example, I had to learn myself. I happen to have 8 children. I expect to be crucified because of that now that I've admitted it, for polluting the universe. But I enjoy my children, and my wife really is somebody who does a very fine job with that. I don't make any apologies for it. But anyway, I found that I couldn't love my sons warmly. I grew up with a stepfather who was very distant, and I didn't have much experience in being close and warm with men, and besides, it was uncomfortable. And so I was loving to my daughter and really quite distant to my son. I used to bring my wife to tears. She would say, "Why don't you love my son?" I said, "I love him, damn it. I just don't, he's a boy, for heaven's sakes. What do you do with a boy? How do you hold a boy? You don't." But fortunately, I counted one of the blessings of my life that I've had enough boys that I've got better with each one of them. And I treat my last boy like a human being, not like somebody I'm terrified of getting close to. And I tried to work to make up to my oldest son some of the really irrational, it was irrational, but it was a lack. I never had learned that it was all right for two males to be warm and affectionate and close to each other. And I can kiss my 2-year-old boy right in the mouth and not worry about, is this evoking homosexual, it's a person, I'm a person, it seems nice to me, I don't worry about him or me, but that's something I achieved, it's not something I grew up with, and so I can understand a little of that, and I know there are people who tell me that they feel creepy-crawly if they think there might be a homosexual next to them. Well, at least the one explanation would be they're afraid of that normal impulse to be warm toward people of their own sex that they've learned to inhibit rigidly, lest they be interpreted as being homosexual and therefore the black hats instead of the white hats. The other explanation is that it's simply learned. It's simply reinforced. It's a bad word. It's a scare word. Just like you say goblins to young children, they feel creepy crawly. You say homosexuals, and it's one of those words that shakes terror into the heart because that's the tone that people say it in. And every time you say homosexuals, you say it with an emotional overtone, then people incorporate that emotional overtone. And if it's a scare word, then everybody clutches. They don't even know why they're afraid. They just clutch. I personally think that that's an equally good explanation, that is simply learned from the emotional overtones of the people. If they say boogeyman in that tone of voice, then you feel boogeyman. If they say homosexual, what's going to happen to me when somebody says something with that kind of a voice? I think that's the way it's communicated.
I would tend to agree with, quite fully, with the one additional point that homosexuality, beyond all of that, is also tied in mistakenly with the whole question of masculinity, femininity. And our society has, as we mentioned before, has this hang-up on masculine and feminine roles, especially masculine roles. And many men seem to feel that any imputation of homosexuality whatsoever is a threat to their masculinity. They feel, even subconsciously, a little bit precarious in their masculinity by any definition of that masculinity. They immediately react to the threat, and you get this whole syndrome.
Again, I have two questions that I'm going to sort of combine. First of all, this one is directed to Dr. Broderick. How do you see us moving away from the phony, stilted dating relationships into more open, freer communications where it won't matter if you bump noses?
Well, that's an important question. I really think that we're getting less judgmental of each other. The fact that you can have this discussion. Here you have not only a homosexual on the stand, but somebody who said fuck, and the whole ceiling didn't come in. I don't use that word in my ordinary language. I grew up as a very nice boy, but I think it's nice to be able to say it once in a while, and just to demonstrate that it's all right to say that if you really want to. The world doesn't come to an end, and of course I may be marched out of here any minute. I don't know, but I think we are more accepting of people, and even people of the opposite sex. And I kind of like that. I like treating people as a human. I often get asked questions like, well, how do you judge somebody who is homosexual or who is an adulterer, as a marriage counselor? What do you do if you get a sinner into your hands, And my feeling is, well, when somebody comes to me, they come to me because they obviously have some problems that they expect me to help them with. And if I'm setting up as to help them with their problems, then I help them with their problems because they're a person coming with a problem. I don't judge them. Who set me up to judge them? And I think we live in a world where people are always complaining it's going to the dogs, but one thing I like about it is that people are accepting each other, and they don't feel quite so defensive, it seems to me, about their big noses or whatever, their homosexuality. People are more open about their strengths and their weaknesses and their unacceptable characteristics and their acceptable characteristics, and we're more permissive of each other doing our own thing. And although I can see the threats that some people find in that, for me that's a wholesome thing, that we're treating each other more like people and not more like men, women, homosexuals, heterosexuals, sinners, saints. I like it. I like it in the pool with the people, and I encourages me to see so much more of that today, it seems to me, than even when I was a boy.
The second part of that question addressed to Dr. Kameny, are homosexual dating relationships more free and more open and less stilted than perhaps heterosexual dating relationships are?
Well, again, you can't draw, you have to be careful at drawing generalizations. Homosexual relationships tend to be so primarily because heterosexual relationships have built themselves up originally around a fear of pregnancy, which made an adversary situation out of the whole thing, unfortunately. Whereas in the case of homosexual relationship, there is no need for that. So the sexual side of the thing, for one thing, is accepted much more routinely. Heterosexually, and again I'm speaking simplistically and illustratively, sex, if it arrives, is the culmination of some sort of a developing relationship, which is a fine way of going about it, but not the only way. Homosexually, it can be that. It can sometimes be the starting point for a fine relationship, which is another excellent way of going about it. And there are many ways to the achievement of the same goal. And so that sex isn't quite the same hang-up as it is, or as it used to be. It's changing heterosexually, although I don't think it's changed as far as it should. And so the answer would be, with some reservations, yes.
Dr. Kameny's talked about discrimination against homosexuals. How about equal rights for those persons who aren't homosexual but are divorcees or just don't want to get married? This person says, I believe they are discriminated against too. And would you like to try and handle that?
Yeah, in a heterosexual society, anybody who's not actively heterosexual is discriminated against. Let me say something that I haven't said. It occurs to me. I'm really pretty conservative in my values. It occurred to me that you might not have been able to figure that out. Most of you maybe could. But I want to say something in behalf of traditional culture, including the discouragement of homosexuality. Not just to be provocative, but because it hasn't been said. Although I very fully believe in accepting individuals, whatever their behavior is, as an individual worth, and I would not in any case believe in persecuting or prosecuting homosexuals who were behaving themselves any more than I would heterosexuals who were behaving themselves, not transgressing other people's rights and so on. I do nevertheless feel that it's in the interest of the society, and more particularly the family, that heterosexuality continue to be the predominant and the sponsored and the preferred way of life. Now I realize that inevitably, if that is so, that by saying it's so, that it will be a disadvantage for those who are either divorced or homosexual or for any reason out of that mainstream. But I myself feel that it's fundamental to social organization that there be powerful motivation toward not only the formation of families but the stability of families. And I know that's in contradistinction to the movement in our society towards the importance of individual worth and individual choice, because this says, yes, but individual worth and choice sometimes, under some circumstances, have to yield to what's the best for the society, for the race, for the future. And I myself am a conservative in that I continue to value and place a high priority upon the stability of families, and even with some modifications we wouldn't have time to discuss, I suppose, traditional moral values which put a premium upon sex in marriage rather than sex outside of marriage, sex in relationships rather than sex at the beginning of relationships that may develop, and so on. I state that not to be argumentative, but because I hadn't said it and you had stated your position so clearly, I thought.
I couldn't disagree more.
Right, I know.
And I feel that the whole trend in our society at the moment is away from that, and it's a good
I agree with
thing.
that. I agree that's
as
the way.
far as, without going to the whole question of family relationships and the values of society versus the interests of the individual, where I feel that in general the individual should be put ahead of society because society exists for the individual and not vice versa. I feel that with regard to your comments on homosexuality, this of course is a part of the more civilized kind of negativism which the homosexual and other minorities face at every turn. And that my reaction to your comments would put them in the same class as a black would to the more civilized forms of racism which he encounters.
I know. Knowing that, think of how brave it was of me to say it anyway. You know?
Another question, perhaps in line with this, why would you advocate, or would you advocate homosexual marriage?
Yes, for those who want it, most certainly. Most homosexuals don't, because the essence of a marriage or a relationship, by marriage I assume they mean a formalized marriage. The essence of a marriage really is the relationship between the two people, and you don't necessarily need it to be legalized or sanctified to create the relationship. However, in our society, since homosexuals arise out of the general culture, in many instances, the feeling that the thing has been legalized or religiously sanctified is psychologically supportive. And if this will, for two particular individuals, support and help stabilize their relationship, then if heterosexuals should have it, homosexuals certainly should. In addition, there are some very practical concerns, things like tax benefits to people who are married, property settlements, inheritances, a whole variety of other factors in which the legalization of marriage can be quite important. And we're working toward that. There are suits going on in the courts in a number of states, 2 men in Minnesota, 2 women in Kentucky, some people in a pair in California, a couple in New York, who are seeking to legalize marriages. Religious ceremonies are being performed increasingly in various parts of the country, but those don't yet have legal weight. They just simply remain a religious ceremony. Let me point out one thing with regard to legalized marriages for homosexuals. The marriage laws in most states were written at a time when it never occurred to the legislators writing the laws that anybody other than a man and a woman would be getting married to each other. And so many of the laws don't specify the relative genders of the people getting married. This is the case in Minnesota, and it was at my suggestion that the 2 people up there, Jack Baker, who was just the homosexual who was just elected president of the University of Minnesota student body, and his friend are seeking to get legally married. And this applies in many other states as well. The Minnesota legislature immediately this past session tried to put in a change to the law to specify. They were persuaded, I haven't gotten the details of the persuasion yet, but they were persuaded not to go ahead with it. So the law remains unchanged, and meanwhile, the case for the legalization of the marriage continues through the courts. It was turned down at the lower court level, and it's being pursued, and if it isn't granted, it will ultimately go to the Supreme Court.
I want to thank both you gentlemen. For those who are interested, we're going to have a discussion group of 4, hopefully, which the 2 guest speakers will participate. So anyone who wants to stay, if you could divide yourself, maybe 1 in the front in this corner, 1 back there, and each of the 4 corners. In about 5 minutes we'll start. Will the people who agree to be discussion leaders come down?
Great pleasure to welcome you to this special seminar sponsored jointly by the Departments of Botany and Forestry. I would also note that students enrolled in the Seminar 71 session on natural resources are participating. We particularly welcome them. We are fortunate today to have an unusually favorable combination of important topic and knowledgeable speaker. Questions concerning the quality of our environment are of increasing but changing concern. A year ago, we were talking a great deal about the fact that, yes, we do have severe problems concerning our environment. I think the focus is beginning to change somewhat in the direction of what are the specifics of these problems and what are we going to do about them. This requires careful examination of the pluses and the minuses of particular alternative courses of action. It is within this sort of a context that we are most fortunate to have as our speaker Dr. Harold Gus Wahlgren of the U.S. Forest Products Laboratory. Gus Wahlgren is a forestry graduate of Iowa State University, obtaining both his bachelor's and master's degrees here, and More recently, his doctorate at Duke University. He is a member of the research staff of the U.S. Forest Products Laboratory. That laboratory is one of national scope that is operated by the Forest Service on the campus of the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Wahlgren will discuss the wood resource and the environment, some national options and alternatives. Gus Wahlgren is a friend of mine of some time standing, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to speak at this seminar, Gus.
Thank you, Dr. Webster. I'm also glad you stepped up here before I did. With all this wiring, I had my doubts as to what was going on. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject I think Dr. Webster hit on very, very nicely is that I want to propose some options and some alternatives to you this afternoon, primarily because of the emphasis being put on by the public or laid down by the public against the Forest Service and perhaps even some of the private industry segments against cutting. Basically, this is what it amounts to. Now, if we had been given a choice of when to live, we could not have chosen a more interesting period. If this period was more interesting, we perhaps couldn't stand it. We have our great problems: peace, population, pollution, and resource management. But I like to think that every problem has a matching opportunity. One approach to problem solution is to instill or foster creativity. Now, creativity needs an air of openness, flexibility, and yes, some risk-taking. Now, discontent is present in our society, but discontent is the breeding ground for creativity and self-renewal. It should also be obvious that the accomplishment of any task or the solution of any problems that I discuss here this afternoon will require the involvement of all people. Now, I have casually mentioned resource management as one of the problem areas of concern, and it is to this subject that I wish to speak to you about. By now, it should be clear to all that the resource problems are real and that some corrective actions are being taken at the insistence of the public. Witness present-day bans on DDT, municipality ordinances against burning, and yes, the recent action by the President halting construction of the Cross Florida Barge Canal. This public awareness, which is candidly shown almost daily in our newspapers and magazines, is not new. It is the seriousness of the problems and the magnitude in terms of the number of people concerned that is new. The seriousness of the problem is emphasized by statements from the President's own Office of Science and Technology, from the National Goals Research Staff, from the National Academy of Science, and from the nation's most capable and respected people. Now, in retrospect, the first great awareness of the importance of resources and the environment came from our energetic forebears working in forestry. Now, these early leaders, by today's standards, would have been called militants with tremendous consciousness of their mission. The research organization I'm working in, the Forest Products Laboratory, as part of the U.S. Forest Service, and our major forestry schools, such as that here at Iowa State University, came into existence as a result of direct involvement of these great pioneers in resource management. Now, if such inheritance counts for anything, then all of us here should be deeply concerned with what seems to be a conservation renaissance. Our predecessors were remarkably successful men who achieved much of what they set out to do. But now we are in a new world, a world which would be scarcely recognizable to the people of even a few decades ago. And the old concept of conservation is acquiring completely new dimensions. World War II interrupted our public concern for conservation. And it was during these war years that we spent resources in prodigious fashion, and their critical importance permanently colored our thinking. It was during the Korean War period that President Truman, in a landmark move, appointed the President's Material Policy Commission under the chairmanship of William Pauley to make a survey of the national requirements, the supplies of materials, the energy sources, and water. Now, in summary, the report calmed fears for the immediate future, but did find cause for concern. Now, about that same time, some modern-day prophets appeared with a disturbing message intended to affect popular thinking. William Voigt, Rachel Carson, John Kenneth Galbraith, and others questioned some of our habits and behaviors. At first, only more thoughtful members of the community were affected. Gradually, however, there developed a growing concern for our exploding national and world population. We have become painfully aware of a population problem, a problem with no easy nor rapid answer. Do you realize that even if we in the United States instantly dropped our birth rate to the mere replacement level, we would still coast up to 300 million people? A far larger percentage increase in world population is inevitable. This increase in demands will pose an enormous resource problem in a very few decades. Now, commensurate with this exploding population in large concentrated city areas was an awareness of our environment. Smog, Doc, you want to turn on those slides? Smog, physical discomfort, and a few deaths made us aware of air pollution. Tourists, vacationers, and recreationists in unprecedented numbers acquired personal awareness of the environment and of some subtle facts that many streams and lakes were unfit for human use. More recently, we heard of the contamination of estuaries, ocean beaches, and the oceans themselves. Accidents like oil spills and ecological surprises like those resulting from DDT, lead, and mercury added to the alarm. Not that we're all lily white, even in the U.S. Forest Service, or even in the wood industry. I put those in for I guess, for my benefit. Even we contribute to this in our present logging operations. I think there's another one there too, Doc. In the United States, our appetite for creature comforts drives our demand for energies and minerals to levels which force increasing dependence on other nations. With 5% of the world population, we use some 40% of its resources. I think that's important enough to repeat. With 5% of the world's population, we are using or consuming 40% of its resources. Currently in the United States, we are temporarily at least in an energy crisis. Now, energy is the lifeblood of our system, and the production of energy is a major source of pollution. Now, as world population and living standards rise, we will find increasing competition for everything we enjoy. Our suppliers will want to sell us not crude oil, but gasoline, not ore, but steel, not steel, but automobiles, and they will want to protect their own future needs. Concerns of the day are forcing us to be much more aware of the interaction between population, adequacy of the resources, energy demands, food supply, water supply, and air and water pollution. All of these together affect what we refer to as the environment, and they have much to do with the quality of life. If we look just a short way into the future, we are driven to the view that we must also be aware of the needs and aspirations of other peoples of the world. We are not self-sufficient. Charitable feelings aside, we will have an insecure existence if we ignore the needs of others and our impact on the rest of the world. This, of course, puts us in the classic dilemma. At the present time, the damage we do to the environment in taking care of our needs is certainly serious and possibly catastrophic. Is it any wonder why there has been an almost unbelievable rise in the numbers and strength of amateur environmental activists? Some of these amateurs provide much of the driving force behind what is happening. Some of their favorite targets have been timber resources managers and the wood industry. This, however, I feel is an undeserved distinction. Other industry groups cause equal or greater environmental damage and not have yet been so fortunate as to receive so much attention. Now, a cynic at this point might say that we are seeing just one more in a succession of cases where the media and the public inflate problems beyond life size. When we discover the cost of correcting the problems, we abandon them for newer and more interesting worries. Is this what is happening to us? As a manager of a forest resource, and I'm speaking about those of us in the Forest Service, we wish to make sound decisions. But in the present flood of diverse and divergent opinions, what are we to do? It is a long time from seedling to mature tree. What will be the place and the need for timber in the world of commerce when the present crop matures, or the crop after that? Our professional responsibilities and our native instincts force us to be very aware of the environment. Forests are not only sources of great aesthetic pleasure, but have all other uses and values, such as that practiced under the multiple use concept on some 187 million acres managed by the U.S. Forest Service. And while they may be old hat to most of us, they are still there. Water, forage, wildlife, recreation, and wood. It is obvious, however, that life in the future will depend overwhelmingly on our ability to make the least damaging compromise. Under wise management, harvesting a crop of timber causes only transient disturbances. But a decision to reduce emphasis on efficient timber production and utilization and to satisfy more material needs with irreplaceable minerals would, I believe, result in greater net damage. Now, the problems posed by all of this are incredibly complex, but decisions must be made, and unless we improve our understandings, we will be managing from a position of ignorance. So we must initiate the task of developing a foundation of facts and opinions and begin the formulation of some options and alternatives if cutting practices of the timber resources are to be halted. We really need a technology assessment for forestry and the wood industry. Wood is one of the most economical, available, and versatile of all our resources. Because of this simple fact, I was interested to read the results of the recent National Academy of Sciences report, Resources and Man. And there's a copy, I spoke about this earlier this morning. How did timber fit into the world it describes? A world which is short of nearly everything but people. I learned that the report had only a few sentences on forests and timber and a conclusion that forests interfere with food production. I consider this strange in a report which addresses itself to the most serious resource problems of the day and which is intended for use by decision makers at the highest level of government and industry. Perhaps in the last analysis, the fact that the importance of timber is not widely recognized is our fault. We obviously have failed to inform the right people about the importance of wood. When we discuss wood as a resource in the world of the future, we must fit it in with all other resources. We cannot do it independently of them. There is great interchangeability in materials for many applications. Beams or panels can be made of steel, aluminum, or fiberglass. The strategy of choosing among alternatives requires some sense of the whole resource picture, of our competitive position in drawing on foreign resources, and how wood can serve to alleviate resource supply and environmental problems. A recent publication by Raymond Ewall, and can I have the next slide, please, Doc, summarizes the resource picture for two giants in the world, the United States and the USSR. His listing of the major raw materials in which we are and are not self-sufficient is startling, and a quick glance at that attests to that point. Some of us conclude that we should use wood efficiently and to the limit of its capacity before arbitrarily encouraging development of substitutes which will cause us to lose vital options in the future. Can I have the next slide, please, Doc? Just a comparison, here again, between the two countries, showing the decline as far as our mineral and forest resources in this country as compared to the incline in the USSR. A shortage of wood will inevitably require us to import more bauxite, iron ore, petroleum, and so on. These are the kind of choices we are talking about. Now, in taking on such a topic, I think I must confess to being an amateur. But where are the experts? We look to economists for projections into the future, but I fear economists are as deficient in judgment concerning the materials, energy, and environmental problems of the future as ecologists are deficient in the techniques of projection. When we look to the National Academy of Science, the National Materials Advisory Board, Congress, research foundations, or the Office of Management and Budget for evidence of sound total resource planning, we are disappointed by their ignorance of the timber resource and its potential. There is great opportunity here for scholarly studies by resource economists. Now, if you think the array of facts I've presented thus far sounds serious, you are quite right. They are serious. With a time scale of a couple of generations into the future, we should be concerned. Our own standard of living might continue to rise, but we must feel concerned for our children and grandchildren. Most people do not think a generation ahead, but we in forestry are accustomed to the idea of planting trees we will not live to see harvested. We must also think in terms of planting the seeds of policies, which eventually will be of great importance to human welfare. By now you must see what I believe the public should expect of timber managers and researchers. We must expand our vision to take in far more ideas than were in the minds of the conservationists in the past. We must think in terms of growing populations with rising expectations and increasing demands for minerals, materials, energy, and corresponding pollution load imposed on the environment. We should think beyond our own needs of what we can produce and import. We should think how others can benefit from the better use of resources. Every aspect of this picture adds to the impressive value of wood to our nation and to the world. It is a renewable resource. Each crop can be better than the one before. It requires relatively simple systems and comparatively little energy in its production, processing, and use. Total pollution problems in properly managed stands with efficient harvesting and utilization will be minor. Now, what are some of the arguments that we use? Well, recently, people in high places have recommended that more effort go into developing substitutes for wood. We argue that this is a poor alternative to increasing the efficiency of growing and utilizing timbers, especially in view of rising national and international demands for all resources. Some even have some suggestions have come from the Office of Management and Budget, Housing and Urban Development, and from the president of the Sierra Club, and from high-level government planners. The aluminum industry, can I have the next slide, please, Doc, has enthusiastically gone along with this. One manufacturer of plastics, can I have the next slide, please, Doc, uses a noble symbol of Smoky for some very questionable advertising along this line. Needless to say, the Forest Service reacted vigorously to this sacrilege. From others, we hear the argument that technology in the past has provided the answers to all scarcity problems, and it will do so in the future. If there is a shortage of wood, it will be compensated by the development of a substitute material. Such ideas, however, were formulated before we understood the full impact of the adverse higher-order effects of mining, power generation, industrial processing, and pollutants and waste which affect our environment. Some support the technology answers all theme by citing that having used up high-grade iron ore, we have learned to produce steel from plentiful taconite. By coincidence, I use the same example to show that we suffer increased land, air, and water pollution when we exhaust our better ores and process minerals of lower grades. More energy and earth-moving equipment are required, more tailings, slag, and residue are generated. Do you know, for example, that taconite tailings continue to pour into Lake Superior at the rate of 67,000 tons a day? By volume of this material, the volume of this material is equal to 1 acre in area and 33 feet daily. And this is not supposed to pollute or harm Lake Superior? A larger amount of steel and other materials is tied up in the industrial plant. We could hypothesize with increasing technological complexity, cumulative arithmetic increases in material production will be accompanied by geometric increases in environmental damage. Finally, if carried to the absurd, much of what is produced in the final stage of such a technological system will go to feed, maintain, and control the monster which has been created. What I am suggesting is that there will be an increasing environmental damage per ton of plastics, aluminum, or steel as demand increases
and resources decline.
Doc, I think there's two more that